Speak up, guys. Today, I bring you a simply unbelievable story. A priest suffered a serious accident, had a near-death experience, and came back with a shocking revelation about what he saw in hell, including priests trapped in eternal suffering. What he discovered will challenge everything you've ever heard about life, death, and spirituality. Before we start, comment here from which city you are watching and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any content like this. Let's go to this impressive story. My name is Ignatius Blackwood, and from a young age the Catholic faith was the compass that guided every step of my existence. I grew up in a small country town where Sundays at church were more than a ritual. They were sacred moments of communion with God and the community. I remember my mother's words, always gentle but firm. Ignatius, faith is the light that never goes out, even on the darkest days. These words deeply marked my soul and pushed me to seek a life dedicated to spirituality. At age 18, I left the security of the family home behind and entered the seminary. I clearly remember the first day, when the cold walls of the cafeteria mixed with the anxiety and excitement of a new beginning. During the long nights of studying, the sound of prayers and choruses served as a constant reminder of the greater purpose I had embraced. At that time, I believed that understanding faith was something simple, an unquestionable truth, since I had been taught to accept dogmas without room for doubt. During my formative years, dialogues with my brothers of faith were intense and full of questions. In one of these long conversations, I remember saying to a colleague, Thomas, don't you feel like we're building our existence around something so solid that nothing can shake it? He, with a calm look, replied, Ignatius, faith is, yes, solid, but never forget that it is also a path of constant questioning and evolution. These exchanges, although often dressed in simplicity, planted in me the seed that faith could be something more than rituals and rules. I was ordained a priest at age 25 and soon found myself immersed in the life of the New Orleans parish. The city, with its rich cultural tapestry, welcomed me in a unique way. Walking through the vibrant streets, where the sound of jazz mixed with the murmur of the faithful provided a sensorial experience that transcended the clerical routine. On many occasions, as I walked to church, I encountered parishioners with life stories that challenged the very notion of faith. One cool autumn morning, while talking to a lady named Eleanor, she said in a trembling voice, Father Ignatius, your words comfort me, but sometimes I feel that there is something beyond what the church teaches us. These words resonated in my heart and, at the same time, made me reflect on the depth of human and divine experience. Even surrounded by voices and stories, I always felt safe in the certainty that faith was the answer to all anguish and uncertainty. But, ironically, that same certainty that once seemed infallible would begin to be questioned in a way I could never have imagined. Every step I took, every prayer I chanted, paved the way for the experience that would challenge not only my beliefs, but the essence of what I understood as life and death. Now, as I reflect on the past, I realize that my journey was marked by an absolute conviction that was sustained in every detail of my religious daily life. However, an invisible and unforeseen force was about to alter the route I had followed so safely. This account, therefore, is the opening of a chapter that challenges everything I knew, a journey that begins in the comfort of faith and culminates in surprising discoveries about the fragility and depth of the human spirit. That afternoon seemed to have been ripped from a movie script, but I could never have imagined that it would be the prelude to such a devastating transformation. The sky, heavy with thick, ominous clouds, announced an impending storm as I drove along the wet roads surrounding New Orleans. The incessant sound of rain hitting the windshield and the rustling of the wind created an unsettling symphony, foreshadowing chaos. As I drove cautiously, immersed in thoughts about the liturgy that comforted me, suddenly, the scene changed in the blink of an eye. A vehicle unexpectedly appeared on the wrong side of the road, like a specter emerging from the rain mist. In an instant, the impact was brutal. The sound of metal twisting and glass breaking merged into a high-pitched scream, echoing inside my car like a wail of pain and despair. God, why is this happening to me? I thought, as reality fragmented into disjointed pieces. The world around me became a blur of colors and sensations, the pain radiating through my body in an almost unbearable way. The physical shock was accompanied by a whirlwind of emotions: fear, disbelief, and a strange feeling that my life was being ripped apart by the second. I tried desperately to find anchorage in what had always been right, but the familiarity of faith seemed to dissolve in that split second. Inside the car, time seemed to have stopped. The deafening sound of rain had been replaced by an internal silence, where only the rapid beat of my heart could be heard. In the midst of this emptiness, I remembered a dialogue that a brother of faith had once uttered during a night of prayers. When the storm arrives, it is in the stillness that we find the voice of God. But in that moment, the words seemed distant, as if an invisible force had taken away all hope. My mind oscillated between the palpable reality of the accident and the strange sensation that I was being thrown out of my own body. As the physical pain intensified, something extraordinary began to happen. The perception of time expanded, and the intensity of suffering began to give way to a feeling of detachment. I saw, from outside, the scene of the accident, the car, the scattered wreckage, the faces contorted in expressions of shock and pain. My physical self, once so steady and present, now seemed like just a receptacle for that surreal experience. The sound of sirens approached, mixed with screams and calls for help, but everything seemed distant, as if I were trapped in a parallel world where pain no longer had the same dominance. In a moment of lucidity, as the darkness seemed to widen around me, I tried to scream for help, but my words were lost in the void, absorbed by the vastness of the unknown. As the impact of the accident left deep marks on both my body and my soul, I realized that this was not just the end of an old life, but the beginning of a journey that would take me beyond the limits of human understanding. The feeling that I was falling apart, that every fragment of my existence was fading away, was accompanied by an inner restlessness that, for a brief moment, made me doubt my own existence. At that moment, reality was transfigured, opening the way to a universe where the physical and the spiritual were inexorably intertwined. And it was on that threshold between pain and dissociation that my near-death experience began to unfold, foreshadowing the profound transformation to come. As I realized that the physical pain was beginning to dissipate, something even stranger came over me, a feeling of detachment, as if my body was falling apart into fragments. As the moments of the accident unfolded around me, I saw my physical self slip away, leaving me with only the pure awareness of existing. I found myself floating outside the twisted car, observing everything with a clarity I never imagined possible. The scene that was once one of terror now seemed coated with a strange serenity. I saw every detail with precision: the wet shine of the rain reflected in the puddles, the debris scattered across the asphalt, and even the distant murmurs of approaching rescuers. Everything was so vivid, but simultaneously, I felt an unusual lightness, as if the weight of my being had suddenly been lifted. This can't be real, I thought, as I saw myself as a mere spectator, oblivious to my own agony. I'm floating. My body, once so familiar, now felt distant, almost as if it belonged to another universe. The transition was disconcerting, but amidst the confusion, an inner voice whispered that this experience was no mere illusion, but the beginning of an unprecedented journey. I wondered, was this the gateway to something beyond what human eyes can see? As that question echoed in my mind, an inexplicable calm began to fill the void the pain had left. In one of these visions, I could notice a vague figure in the distance, also floating, as if it were part of this new and ethereal panorama. I felt a strange familiarity, although I couldn't clearly identify his features. For a brief moment, the environment became a dance of light and shadow, and I didn't know if it was reality or some kind of lucid dream. The silence was almost deafening, and every breath I imagined made itself felt in the immensity of the space where my physical consciousness previously resided. Between this calm and emptiness, a distant memory emerged. I remembered moments of intense prayer, where the feeling of being closer to the divine seemed to transport me to an unusual state of peace. Now, as I floated, it was as if that peace had become tangible, a subtle energy that permeated every inch of this new space. A voice, Or perhaps it was just an echo of the prayers he had once sung, repeated, "Let go, allow yourself to be. The body is just a part, but the essence is eternal." There was no fear, just intense curiosity. I tried to understand what was happening, looking for an explanation that went beyond the dogmas that defined my existence for so long. The freedom of that feeling was overwhelming. I felt that, for a brief moment, the barriers between the physical and the spiritual had dissolved, and I was able to see the true essence of things. As I floated, I remembered the conversations I had with other believers, those moments when we questioned what life was, what the soul was, and how faith could transcend matter. Now, all that took on a new meaning. I was experiencing a reality where pain was no longer the ruling law, but rather a smooth transition to a purer, more authentic state of being. Suddenly, as I found myself immersed in that state of lightness and detachment, I felt an irresistible force pull me forward. The landscape around me began to transform. The gray tones of the wreckage and shadows gave way to an intense and welcoming light. I found myself being led into a tunnel of light, a shimmering corridor that stretched endlessly, with colors ranging from gold to silver, as if time and space had merged in a divine dance. As he advanced, the sensation was of a subtle but continuous acceleration, as if he were being transported to a new level of existence. The silence was broken by a soft but piercing chorus of voices that seemed to emerge from all directions. They were not defined words, but comforting murmurs full of meaning, which invited me to deep introspection. "Is this real?" I asked myself, though my inner voice sounded more like a whisper of doubt than a declaration of disbelief. As I approached the end of the tunnel, the voices became clearer. I could make out words and even names that echoed in my mind. They were the voices of loved ones, friends who have passed away, and even former brothers of faith, whose memories were intertwined in a whirlwind of feelings and memories. In one of these moments, I clearly heard the soft voice of my late grandmother. "My grandson, everything is fine. Follow love and don't fear the unknown." The comfort of these words invaded my being, bringing a feeling of peace that I had never experienced in life. However, the multiplicity of voices also flooded me with questions. Behind each welcoming word, there was a mystery, an invitation to understand that reality was much more complex than the rigid dogmas I carried. As I walked through the tunnel, the scenery seemed to take on a life of its own. Rays of light gently danced around me, creating patterns that defied rational description. In one of these moments, a deep and serene male voice cut through the silence. "Ignatius, this is the threshold between what you know and what lies beyond. Listen, feel, and allow the truth to guide you." The voice reverberated through the tunnel, and for a brief moment, I felt as if I were before an immense congregation of souls, all united in the same purpose, the search for the essence of the divine. Beside me, translucent figures appeared and disappeared, like shadows from a past that still accompanied me, and with each new face, a story was told without the need for words. The emotional impact was immense. Amid the ethereal beauty of that place, the feeling of belonging and, at the same time, transcendence invaded me. I saw myself floating, no longer as a mere spectator, but as an active participant in a cosmic orchestra, where each note was a lived experience, each silence an invitation to reflection. Through the clarity of the tunnel, I could discern moments of happiness, pain, regret, and redemption. Each voice, each glow, seemed to carry the story of a life, teaching me that spiritual paths are not linear, but rather full of encounters and goodbyes, of interspersed lights and shadows. I felt, then, that my journey was unfolding in multiple directions, where the truth was revealed in luminous and eternal fragments. As he progressed through the tunnel of light, something unsettling began to seep into the shimmering scenery. The intensity of the light gradually gave way to an unsettling gloom. It was as if a heavy curtain of shadows had suddenly been pulled back, sucking out the vibrant energy that surrounded me and replacing it with an icy, suffocating cold. I felt, in the next instant, that every ray of light was being swallowed by a darkness that approached with the precision of a predator. "What is happening?" I muttered to myself, my voice filled with an anxiety I couldn't control. The answer came not in words, but in the silent sound of fading. The soft chorus of voices that once surrounded me began to distort, turning into sad, disjointed murmurs, as if the words were being swallowed by an unfathomable abyss. In this new environment, the space seemed to vibrate with an oppressive energy. The colors that once sparkled now turned into grayish, somber tones, where each movement was slow and drawn out. The air felt heavy, as if I were breathing through a dense curtain of fog. Each particle seemed to carry an emotional weight, a sadness that invaded my soul. As I floated on that threshold between light and dark, a figure appeared vaguely in the distance, moving slowly. As I got closer, I could see that it was a dark representation of everything I feared. It was not an entity with defined features, but rather the personification of despair, a shadow that seemed to drain all the hope that still resided within me. "Ignatius," whispered the figure, his voice a distant and melancholic echo, as if coming from an endless tunnel. "Who are you?" I replied, with a tremor in my voice that I barely recognized myself. The answer came with immense sadness, but without clarity. It was as if the shadow was the very reflection of all my doubts and fears accumulated over the years. I felt darkness creeping not only around me, but also within me, awakening feelings of inadequacy, guilt, and regret that had long been buried beneath the rigidity of an unshakable faith. The sensation was of being swallowed by a sea of despair, where each drop of black water carried with it the anguish of unlived lives and poorly made choices. I remembered old sermons, times when I had proclaimed the supremacy of light and truth, but now, in this palpable darkness, everything seemed empty, insignificant. The shadow continued to advance, and with it, the voices became more confused and full of laments. "You can't escape what you feel, Ignatius," the dark voice insisted, now closer, almost whispering directly into my ear. Pain, shame, and fear intertwined, forming a web of emotions that threatened to consume me completely. In the midst of this turmoil, I remembered the times I sought shelter in faith, seeking comfort in the certainty that everything was under God's protective eye. However, at this moment, faith seemed to become a burden, a weight that I could no longer support. Every beat of my heart seemed to echo the uncertainty of my existence. I was faced with the raw truth. The darkness was not an external enemy, but a part of me, a manifestation of my own fears and the disconnection I had cultivated over the years. The internal struggle was intense, and I knew that, to cross that barrier, I would have to face every shadow, every murmur of regret, and allow the pain to turn into learning. Suddenly, the darkness thickened, and the environment around me began to transform into a scene I had never imagined. The faded colors gave way to intense but disturbing hues, where the ground seemed to pulse as if it had a life of its own, radiating emotions of fear and despair. Every step I took, however floating, revealed a new layer of torment, and soon I found myself immersed in a vision that many would call hell. The voices that had previously whispered vaguely now intensified, echoing wails and cries of anguish. I saw wandering souls wandering aimlessly, some with faces disfigured by pain, others crying tears that turned to smoke in the suffocating air. Everything there was a raw expression of suffering. The air was permeated with an uncomfortable, almost palpable heat that made every sigh a struggle to breathe. As my eyes, or rather, my perception beyond my eyes, swept across the bleak landscape, familiar faces began to emerge from the shadows. One by one, figures from my past materialized in vivid detail. Among them, an image emerged of a man I admired and considered a spiritual mentor, the Reverend Cassius Monroe. His face, once serene and welcoming, was now marked by expressions of pain and regret, as if the shadows had exposed the flaws he had worked so hard to hide. "Ignatius," the Reverend's voice sounded, trembling and filled with deep sadness, reverberating in the environment. "Cassius, why are you here?" I asked, my voice full of disbelief and regret as I tried to understand what this encounter meant. His answer didn't come in clear words, but rather in a look that conveyed a silent confession. His eyes, once filled with religious fervor, now mirrored the raw truth. The devotion he held was, in large part, a mask to hide hypocrisy and pride. This face, which I had always seen as an example of holiness, now became a mirror of human imperfection. He seemed to beg for forgiveness, not from a distant deity, but from his own heart that had long refused to recognize his mistakes. Around me, other figures stood out. I saw the faces of friends and family, each marked by choices and regrets. Some were known, others merely reflections of an afflicted collective conscience. Amid the cacophony of laments, I could hear murmurs that brought painful truths to the surface. There is no redemption for those who have turned away from the light. Pride is the gateway to darkness. These phrases echoed, cutting through the oppressive silence with the harshness of a reality that I never wanted to face. The hellish scenario was not a punishment imposed by a divine punishment, but rather a revelation of the consequences of living a faith devoid of authenticity and compassion. Each face that emerged seemed to be a reminder that our mistakes and hypocrisy often become the source of inner torment. In the midst of pain and anguish, I felt that this vision was not just meant to punish me, but to teach me. The image of Reverend Cassius, with his pleading look, insisted on showing me that true holiness does not reside in unquestionable rituals and doctrines, but in the sincerity of the heart. I realized then that the hell unfolding before me was, in fact, a reflection of our own choices, a manifestation of the dark parts of our souls. At the climax of that hellish scenario, when the weight of wandering souls and the murmur of regrets seemed ready to suffocate me, a figure emerged from the shadows with silent authority. It wasn't just another of the images that materialized in the chaos. It was the Reverend Cassius Monroe, the mentor who, in life, I had revered as a model of unshakable faith. His presence, however, was now coated with an aura of sadness and revelation, as if every wrinkle and mark on his face told a story of guilt and remorse. "Ignatius," he pronounced, his voice filled with a deep regret that echoed through the room, each syllable imbued with a painful truth. I hesitated for a moment, stunned by the transformation of the man who had once guided me. "Cassius, why are you here? What happened to you?" My voice trembled, reflecting the mixture of disbelief and pain I felt when I saw that mentor undone by his own hypocrisy. He remained silent for a moment, his eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to recall memories buried beneath layers of past idealizations. When he finally responded, it was with brutal sincerity. "I was wrong, Ignazio. For years, I used devotion as a cloak to hide the vices of pride and vanity. My prayers were not driven by a genuine love for God, but by a burning desire to be seen as perfect, as holy in the eyes of others. Today, I see that true faith requires humility, a recognition that we are fallible and yet loved." His words rang like a warning bell amid the cacophony of torment. As he spoke, I saw in his face the mirror of human imperfection, the fragility hidden beneath a facade of holiness. "I was your guide, Ignatius, and now, on this threshold between light and darkness, I am just a reflection of what I should never have been. My devotion was a mask, a facade built on the foundations of my own arrogance." His words, filled with an almost palpable lament, confronted me with the reality that faith, when devoid of authenticity, turns into a prison for the soul. The surrounding atmosphere seemed to vibrate with the intensity of the revelation. The laments of souls and cries of repentance seemed to pause, as if hell itself was listening to that intimate confrontation. "But, Cassius," I began, my voice hesitant, trying to understand how that revered man had found himself in such a state of desolation. "The hell I see is not imposed by God, but is a reflection of what we choose to be. When we live faith as a simple obligation, without the genuine love that must permeate every act, we ourselves create our torments," he replied, with silent tears running down his face, marked by time. At that moment, I felt that the mentor was offering me not just an account of his fall, but a vital lesson, that true holiness is not in external perfection or in the blind fulfillment of rituals, but in the integrity of the heart. "Look inside, Ignatius. Face the shadows that inhabit your being and allow true love to be your light. Only in this way will you be able to transcend the limitations imposed by a dogma that often deprives us of the truth of who we really are. The encounter with Cassius was painful, as it revealed the weaknesses that all of us, even the most devout, carry. But at the same time, it was an opportunity for redemption, an invitation to drop the false masks and embrace the vulnerability necessary to grow spiritually. As his words echoed in the void of that inner hell, I felt a wave of compassion and relief, as if admitting other people's mistakes allowed me to also face my own. It was at that moment that I realized that the mentor, despite his fall, still carried the spark of wisdom that had always characterized him. And in doing so, he showed me the path to true transformation, accepting our imperfections and through them finding a deeper, more real divine love. At the exact moment when the shadows seemed to close around me, threatening to submerge me in an abyss of anguish and hopelessness, an intense light broke through the darkness, like the brightness of a dawn that dispels the densest night. This light was not blinding or harsh, but soft and welcoming, enveloping me in a comforting warmth that contrasted sharply with the oppressive cold that had gripped the room moments before. At the epicenter of this light, a presence revealed itself, a being with a resplendent aura, whose essence emanated a peace and compassion that transcended all my previous experiences. The figure approached slowly, and I could see details that defied earthly description. His eyes shone with a depth that seemed to contain the universe itself, and his voice, when he spoke, sounded like a sacred melody, each word loaded with meaning and tenderness. Ignatius, fear not. I am Seraphina Lumen, and I came to show you that the hell you saw is not a divine punishment, but a reflection of what is in your own heart when you turn away from love. His words penetrated the deepest layers of my being, causing every fear and every doubt to dissolve in the immensity of that moment. As he spoke to me, I felt that his words were not mere explanations, but rather a revelation of a long-hidden truth. Hell is not a physical place, but the result of disconnection from divine love and the refusal to recognize our own vulnerability. Amidst the light, Seraphina's presence seemed to transcend time and space. Their gestures were graceful, almost choreographed, and each movement seemed to orchestrate a dance of redemption that touched the essence of existence. I, who for so long believed that faith was based on dogmas and rituals, now saw the truth revealed through that angelic entity. Many get lost following rules and traditions without questioning the origin of their devotion, continued Seraphina, with a soft but firm tone. The hell you experienced is, in fact, the silenced cry of a heart that has strayed from true love. It manifests itself when pride and hypocrisy are allowed to take the place of compassion and humility. As his words echoed across the luminous expanse, I felt a deep sense of relief. In my mind, images of moments of silence and introspection followed one another, each one revealing small weaknesses and fears that, when confronted, could be transformed into sources of light. Seraphina's presence seemed to tell me that every tear and every drop of pain had a purpose, which was to awaken the truth about the nature of divine love, which manifests itself not as a harsh judgment, but as an unconditional embrace. In a pause that seemed to immortalize the moment, she extended her hand, and I felt a comforting energy that coursed through every fiber of my being. It was as if all my wounds, both visible and invisible, were slowly beginning to close, allowing hope to blossom amidst the chaos. "Don't let fear paralyze you, Ignatius," she murmured, almost like a whisper in the wind. "The path of true faith is one that accepts imperfection and finds the essence of the divine in vulnerability." With each word, the light intensified, filling the space around me and pushing away the shadows that once threatened to swallow me. I felt that, finally, there was the possibility of a fresh start, of a renewed faith that was not based on empty rituals, but on the authentic experience of love and compassion. The intensity of the light emanating from Seraphina Lumen seemed, with each instant, to penetrate deeper into my soul, revealing hidden layers of long-buried emotions and memories. The feeling was one of rebirth, where pain and despair slowly turned into palpable hope, like the gentle breeze that announces the arrival of morning after a long night. As I felt enveloped by this transformative energy, The entity's words resonated in my mind. Your mission has not yet come to an end, Ignacio. This is just the beginning of a new awakening. With each syllable, an indisputable truth settled in my being. My journey, which until then had been marked by a rigid and unshakable faith, now unfolded in the light of a revelation that questioned everything I knew. I realized that the hell I had witnessed was not a punishment imposed from outside, but the natural consequence of a deep disconnection from divine love, a disconnection that, if corrected, could lead to redemption and true inner peace. Serafina continued, "Embrace your flaws, Ignatius, and allow unconditional love to heal you. Faith is not a burden to be borne, but the essence that should illuminate every act of your life." The energy of this message coursed through my being like a river of light, purifying every corner where fear and guilt once resided. It was at that moment that I felt an irresistible force, as if the universe itself was aligning itself to pull me back into the physical world. The contours of my existence began to dissolve and simultaneously reconstruct themselves with unprecedented clarity. In the blink of an eye, darkness and light intertwined in a whirlwind that took me to the point of no return. The sensation was of a deep dive, where time seemed to extend infinitely and at the same time condense into a single instant of revelation. I knew without a doubt that I was about to return to my body, but now with a perspective that could never be the same. Before the transition was complete, I heard Serafina's serene voice again. "Take with you what you learned here, Ignacio. True faith is the freedom to love, to forgive, and to accept that we are all imperfect. Don't forget, love is your greatest weapon against darkness." With those words, a gentle but decisive force enveloped me, pulling me back into the physical dimension. I felt a rush, a kind of internal rebirth, and then, in the blink of an eye, I woke up in a hospital bed, in the soft light of a New Orleans morning. The sound of monitors and the murmur of healthcare professionals brought me back to reality, but something in me had changed forever. Every cell in my body seemed to vibrate with the new understanding that now pulsed in my heart. I was alive, but no longer like the Ignatius I once knew. For the next 2 weeks in a coma, while my body regenerated, my mind chained itself to that experience. Vivid dreams, where light and darkness intertwined, accompanied me even in moments of sleep. Every sigh and every beat of my heart seemed to remind me of the mission that still awaited me, transforming pain and suffering into a testimony of divine love, so that true faith would be reborn within me and those who crossed my path. Waking up in a hospital bed in New Orleans was a shock to my soul, as impactful as the accident itself that had ripped me from the life I knew. The white walls of the room, the fluorescent lights, and the rhythmic sounds of the monitors created a scene that, at first glance, seemed routine. However, internally, I found myself immersed in an intense battle where physical pain and spiritual crisis merged into a symphony of doubts and concerns. In the dim light of dawn, while the hospital was still asleep, I found myself alone with my thoughts. Every beat of my heart seemed to mark the rhythm of a crisis that I could never ignore. Sitting on the edge of the bed, with my eyes fixed on the ceiling, I asked myself out loud, as if the walls could offer some comfort, how can I continue preaching the faith that I have always believed to be infallible, when everything I have experienced questions every prayer, every ritual, every dogma? The answer came in the form of silence, interrupted only by the hum of equipment and the distant whisper of nurses talking. However, in the midst of that silence, an inner voice insisted on revealing that the truth I had known was just a part of a much larger universe where pain and redemption walked side by side. During the days that followed, the physical recovery process was accompanied by a deep dive into the crisis of faith that haunted me. I was talking to Dr. Mitchell, a man of few words but with a look that overflowed with compassion, who once commented, "Father, the healing of the body often precedes the healing of the soul. Allow yourself to feel this pain. It can be the path to something new." These words echoed in my mind, but they also generated an internal conflict. How could I accept that the faith that had always guided my life was now being questioned? Every memory of moments spent in church, every prayer sung with fervor, seemed to turn into a reminder of a truth that I was forced to confront. blind belief in rituals was not enough to deal with the complexities of being human. In long nightly conversations with a few parishioners who visited me, anguish was mixed with a sense of urgency. Nathaniel Brooks, always sincere and direct, declared on one of these visits, "Father, I see you differently now. Your pain, your doubts. This does not make you less divine, but more human. Maybe this is the faith we need, one that embraces uncertainty and values true love." These words, spoken with a simplicity that seemed to extract the essence of suffering, began to open holes in my armor of conviction. On the other hand, the persistent darkness of the nights caused the old certainty that the Church was the only source of salvation to disintegrate, leaving me vulnerable to the temptation of skepticism and isolation. As the days passed, I found myself torn between the security of the traditions I had always followed and the restlessness of a new awakening. In moments of solitary introspection, I remembered the teachings of Serafina Lumen, whose comforting voice whispered that the true spiritual path lay in the acceptance of imperfections and the sincere search for love. However, the pressure from a community that still expected a firm and unshakable stance from me weighed like an inescapable burden. Every physical therapy session, every doctor appointment, was also a reminder of how fragile existence could be. The struggle to regain physical mobility was reflected in the struggle to regain a faith that now proved to be multifaceted and challenging. I found myself in a state of constant questioning, where lonely tears at dawn mixed with the anguish of a heart that searched for meaning. At the end of this troubled period, I realized that true recovery did not lie in returning to being the priest I once was, but in accepting the crisis as an integral part of a process of spiritual rebirth. It was then that I began to understand that faith, no matter how shaken it was, could rebuild itself with the foundations of doubt and authentic love, paving a new path for my existence.